Recording. Okay, so welcome. We are discussing the death penalty in Jewish tradition. And before we read the article, I'm just curious as to your own views on the death penalty, either coming out of your own sense of morality, or if you, if you have a sense of that it derives from your Jewish belief. I would like to know that too. So Bryce, your hand is up quickly.
I'm against the death penalty. My rationale is simply that one can never know whether one is actually correct in assessing that someone is worthy of that, or whether someone is even guilty of that. And there's no way to be 100% sure, so you should never apply a 100% penalty.
So actually, that is I think it's an excellent argument and a reasonable argument. But what I would ask is, suppose you were 100% certain that if a crime was committed on video and it was clearly a murder, and would you then be in favor of the death penalty?
I would have to say that it's because certainly considering today's age and the ability to completely create video on demand that can show anything you wish.
But without
no, wait.
Okay.
What you're asking is, suppose that everyone could fly through the sky. Well, everything that follows from it just becomes like meaningless.
No, what I'm really
say that you can be 100% sure is an absurdity from the beginning.
Okay,
and so the beginning of your syllogism doesn't work because it's absurd from the beginning.
Okay, so what I'm really trying to get at is, quite often people will use that argument, and then if you pose even a hypothetical question that if you were absolutely certain, they are often still against the death penalty. So then I think it's reasonable to be against the death penalty, but if you were absolutely certain that the person was guilty, then that's not the reason you're against the death penalty. That's the only thing I'm getting at.
Everybody that convicts somebody of to the death penalty is absolutely certain of it, even if they're wrong.
Okay, so let's other ideas about your ideas about death penalty. Nobody? Oops. Okay.
I guess my point would be, what if you actually witnessed a murder? You actually saw it with your own eyes. I mean, at that point, you're 100% certain that the person committed the murder. Would you, at that point,
yes,
be in favor of the death penalty? I'm ambivalent. I'm actually ambivalent, which sounds like wishy-washy, sitting on the fence kind of thing. But I think it depends on the circumstances. I know my meditation teacher always says, it depends. And that's sort of where I would be.
Okay. Jay? You're muted, Jay. Jay, you're muted.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Bryce.
Yeah.
You said you are totally opposed to the death penalty. Now, I don't want to get any problems for saying this, but I'm going to say it. Are you opposed to DT getting the death penalty?
Are you opposed to what? I'm sorry.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Who?
You know who I'm talking about.
You mean Donald Trump?
Yes.
I don't want Donald Trump to get the death penalty.
You don't?
No.
Okay. I want to cut that off. I'm not interested in that answer. I am interested in the answer that if you were certain and you personally witnessed a murder, would that change your perspective?
Well, if I might answer that just briefly, because how would you institutionalize that? Does someone just come up and say, "I saw a murder, so let me kill that guy"?
No, I'm not asking.
No, I understand, but the hypothetical itself.
What I'm really asking, and let me ask it in a different way. Is your opposition to the death penalty rooted in the uncertainty of the crime taking place, or in moral opposition to the concept of a death penalty, or are they the same? Okay,
Both.
okay, that's fair. Okay, any other thoughts on the death penalty before we jump into the article? Okay, so we'll see this in the article, but many people are surprised to hear that the death penalty is the only mitzvah. You may find it hard to hear the word mitzvah associated with the death penalty. It's the only Bethany's surprised. It's the only mitzvah that's mentioned in every book of the Torah. In every book of the Torah, there is the commandment that if someone takes a life, someone murders, their life should be forfeit. So, anyway, so that I think that's a important place to start. So I
A
am
mitzvah is a holy obligation, isn't it?
no, a mitzvah is a commandment.
Okay.
That and it's a commandment that's based
I
either
mean,
in
you're
Torah
obliged,
or
you're
in rabbinic.
obliged to obey commandments, so.
Yes, yes. So yes. Okay, so let me.
Quickly for that, if you don't mind, is there
Yeah.
any other mitzvah that's more clear than that? I mean, you said it's it's
Well,
repeated so many times.
Yeah, it doesn't resolve the issue that Bryce raises, although you'll see how the rabbis do that and the requirement for witnesses. Obviously, the Talmudic material isn't going to address videos, but it's going to address witnesses. Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to cook a baby goat in its own mother's milk. That's mentioned 3 times. Actually, you know what the most repeated mitzvah in the Torah is? It's to
Remember
not
the stranger,
to
fatherless, and the home.
protect the powerless, the widow, and the stranger, and that's 36 times in the Bible. Okay, so I presume you can see the article, yes, and rather than
Yes.
putting the PDF up on it, it's actually the version that's just online. So I'll read the opening. The death penalty in Jewish tradition. Capital punishment allowed in the Torah and Talmud, but rarely carried out by Jewish courts. Okay, would someone like to read text?
I'll read.
Okay, thank you.
The Torah prescribes death as punishment for a number of serious sins, among them murder, idol worship, and desecration of the Sabbath, as well as several seemingly less serious ones, like serially disobeying one's parents. In practice, however, death sentences were rarely carried out by Jewish courts. A famous Mishnah passage states that a religious court that executed someone once in 70 years was considered destructive. That gap between principle and practice is often cited as evidence that Judaism is deeply uncomfortable with capital punishment. So much so that the rabbis of the Talmud erected significant legal bulwarks to make it exceedingly rare. Others argue that the Torah's explicit judgment that certain crimes merit a sentence of death is irrefutably proof that capital punishment is consistent with Jewish tradition.
In a way, what Jewish tradition is really looking at is very similar to Bryce's comment, without necessarily addressing the issue of whether capital punishment is justice or not. It's really going to put legal barriers like the number of witnesses and the way people are forewarned. I think you'll see it. Okay, Jay, if you'd like, continue, or someone else can pick up.
Sure, that's good.
Thank you.
The death penalty in the Torah. The Torah imposes a penalty of death for a range of misdeeds. These include ritual infractions, such as violating the Sabbath. You're trying to tell me that a penalty of death for screwing up Shabbat?
Yes, I'm not trying to tell you it. I am telling you that the Torah prescribes death for violating the Sabbath, and even more astounding, the Torah for doing malacha, for doing work on the Sabbath, and even more astounding, the Torah doesn't prescribe what malacha is. So it's doubly outrageous. And then picking up on something that Stephen was saying as we were just, chatting and getting together this evening, what the rabbis of the Talmud notice is that right after one of the prohibitions against doing work on the Sabbath, the Torah text leads into an extensive discussion of what kinds of things are work. And so the rabbis make that connection, that what they were after were the elements that would be needed in constructing the tabernacle. But that's actually in the Mishnah. It's not in the Bible. But yes, the penalty for violating the Sabbath is death.
Worshipping idols and cursing God, sexual sins, including incest, adultery, anal sex between men, and bestiality, and various criminal acts, including murder, kidnapping, and giving false testimony in a capital case. Giving false testimony. Okay, I'll continue. In one particularly challenging biblical passage, the Torah imposes a penalty of death by stoning in the case of a wayward son who does not heed his parents' discipline. The Talmud states that there never actually was a wayward son, nor will there ever be one, and that the Torah mentions it merely so it should be studied.
Yeah, let me comment on that. This is actually a very famous case if you get into this kind of material. In Deuteronomy, there is a specific statement about if someone has a rebellious and wayward son, his father and mother should take him by the hand and bring him to the gate of the city, and say to the gate, "Our son is wayward and gluttonous and rebellious," and so on. And the people in the gate will stone him to death. And it's very clear. And so how did the rabbis get rid of it? It's actually a great exercise in rabbinic. There's a statement where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. So how do the rabbis get rid of it? First of all, they eliminate half of all the children by pointing out that it is a son, so no daughters. And then they address the question, well, if the individual is a child, that individual is not responsible for his actions. So anyone under the age of 13 would not be subject to this punishment. And then I was just rereading the article, an article about this, and they say, well, if the child is much older than 13, it's no longer a child and not subject to this. So the rabbis of the Talmud say it has to be within 3 months of the young man turning 13. That's the only time it applies. Then it says the mother and father will take him by the hand. So the rabbis say, well, it must be take him equally. So the mother and father actually have to have the same stature, height, and so on. And the mother and father announce to the community. So the mother and father have to speak with an identical voice. They have to sound, mother and father have to be identical to one another. And then they also, specify what does it mean to be gluttonous and how many, lugs of wine and so on does the child have to drink. So basically they eliminate any possibility that this could ever take place. And then they ask the question in the Talmud, why does the Torah state this? And basically the answer is the one you just read, just for the intellectual discipline of studying it. Okay, so we're going to pick up right here, Jay,
Stoning.
with stoning. Stoning is
the most common method of execution described in the Torah. Does that mean throwing stones at people?
So that's also discussed in the Talmud. And just the fact that the Talmud discusses this is kind of interesting because the Talmud is codified in about the year 500 or so. And, you know, the authorities, the Jewish authorities, have no authority to put anyone to death. So I remember studying this, and basically they say you take someone and you take them to a certain height and throw them off a cliff. And I remember them saying, drop a stone on him, or just dying from the fall. They considered stoning, because presumably the person would hit the stones when he fell. And I was just reading an article tonight. They say you don't want it too high because then the corpse would be mutilated, and you don't do that in Judaism. And you don't want it too low because then the person might not die. But yeah, stoning is in the Bible, and of course in the New Testament you have this image, and in Monty Python films and other biblical films, you know, you have this image of the person standing there, and people are just throwing rocks at him. Okay.
The Torah specifies that a person may be put to death only on the testimony of two witnesses, never by one alone. And that the witness who testified must be the first to lay their hands on the accused to kill him. Death by fire is mandated for a number of sexual sins by fire, mainly various forms of incest.
And again, if you start doing some research on how did the rabbis and other legal codes prescribe death by fire, it's not what you think, namely burning at the stake. They are inspired by the story I think we're about to study on Saturday mornings. I think it's going to be actually studied this Saturday morning, of Nadav and Avihu, when they offer strange incense, a strange fire to God. What happens is a fire comes from the altar or somewhere from heaven.
Well, they played with the wrong pan.
I'm sorry?
They played with the wrong pan.
Yes, they violated the rules, and the fire enters their body and kills them from the inside. So the technique is to try and emulate that. And so there's some actually pretty graphic descriptions of this. But again, I remember in rabbinical school saying you force the person's mouth open, and then they would pour molten lead into the person so as not to desecrate their body. Now, this may never have been done, but the rabbis, because the rabbis that are writing these rules have no power to put anybody to death. But that was one of the things that I came across. Okay, would someone else like to pick up death penalty in the Talmud? Okay, Ken.
Death penalty in the Talmud. The rabbis of the Talmud discuss the legal requirements of capital punishment at great length, establishing significant barriers that made such a penalty extremely difficult to carry out. According to the Mishnah, capital cases had to be decided by a Sanhedrin of 23 judges. If the conviction in a capital case was unanimous, rendered too quickly, the accused was acquitted on the assumption that the judges had not adequately considered the possibility of the defendant's innocence. Perhaps most onerous of all, the offense had to be witnessed by two people who warned the perpetrator immediately prior to committing the act that it was a capital offense.
So again,
stringency.
Let me just comment on that. Actually, why don't we finish the paragraph?
Such stringencies are often understood to account for the famous Mishnah passage that states that if a Sanhedrin executed one person in 7 years, it was considered destructive. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah objects that the standard is actually once in 70 years, and rabbis Tarfon and Akiva say that had they served on the court, one would have never been executed. No one would have ever been executed.
Yeah. So this is kind of like the Miranda warning of Miranda warnings. So first of all, you needed two witnesses that actually witnessed the act. And in the Talmud, it says, you know, if somebody sees person A chasing person B with a knife, and they go into a house or a cave, I can't remember what the case is, and the person comes out, and, you know, person B has been stabbed to death, and person A has the knife in his hand and blood all over him, that is not sufficient. That you actually need two witnesses to the actual act. And then what also the Talmud adds is that, so person A again is chasing person B. The witnesses are there. The witnesses have to, before the act is committed, ask the potential murderer, do you realize you're about to commit a capital offense? And if you do it in front of us, then you may be put to death. And the person presumably acknowledges that, yes, I've been warned, I'm going to do it anyway. There was a mention, I think, in the earlier paragraph that the witnesses are actually involved in the execution rather than just serving as witnesses. And there's also provision that if someone testifies falsely in one of these cases, that the person that testifies falsely is subject to being put to death themselves. And there was, again, I remember studying this, I didn't do the research, that when the person is being marched off to execution, there are people like with flags announcing that an execution is about to take place. And if anyone has any, evidence to the contrary, that this person is guilty of a capital offense, they should speak up.
That
So-
sounds like at Christian
Well,
weddings.
Yes.
If-
I'm sorry, say
Sounds
again,
like a
Steve.
wedding.
What'd you say,
I
Steve?
said, sounds like at Christian weddings when they say, if anyone knows any reason we can't do this, let him speak now or forever hold his
Yes,
peace.
I don't say that. Because
I
I
said
am
at
sure
Christian
at some point in time, someone would speak up and then I would have no idea what to do. Yes. Yeah. But this is, a lot more serious.
It's never done at Jewish weddings. It's a Christian practice.
Okay. So, Ken, why don't you continue? However, some scholars.
However, some scholars, such as Rabbi Louis Jacobs in the Jewish Religion, a Companion, have noted that the power of Jewish courts to impose a death sentence was ended by the Romans sometime in the first century of the Common Era, and as a result, the Talmudic discussions of the matter, including their imposition of stringent rules of evidence in capital cases, should be understood as purely theoretical, not as practical guidance for how such cases should actually be adjudicated. Jacobs also points to passages in the Talmud and elsewhere that permit extrajudicial execution in certain circumstances as evidence that Jewish law is not as uncomfortable with the death penalty as is sometimes said to be the case. Maimonides writes in the Mishnah Torah that in a case where someone commits murder but cannot be convicted on account of some technicality, the killer is to be fed bread and water until he aches and then fed barley until his stomach ruptures.
Go figure this one. I don't want to defend Maimonides on that one. He was a doctor, though, so presumably there's some medical basis for this.
Barley swells like rice,
Okay. Yeah,
and
so-
it
okay.
can make you very uncomfortable.
Apparently. Okay, Ken?
A similar punishment is described by the Talmud for repeat offenders. Elsewhere, Maimonides writes that a king may execute a killer even without clear proof or a warning for the sake of public order, and may even leave their bodies hanging for days to instill fear in the hearts of the wicked. The Talmud endorses a similar position, saying that in certain extreme circumstances, courts may impose a death penalty even if the standard legal requirements are not met. The Shulchan Aruch later codified that ruling, saying that punishment of death could be imposed without clear testimony at times of rampant sinfulness.
And remember, the Shulchan Aruch is the code of law created in about the year 1500. It's the first code of law that was created after the invention of the printing press. So it's very widely disseminated.
It's also the meal at the Seder.
It's orech. It's actually, hold on a second. No, it's the same root, but it's actually a slightly different word. Aruch means arranged, an arranged table. And actually, I'm not even sure what the exact definition, but it's slightly different vocalized, but it's, yeah, it's what the meal is described as. Okay, let's continue. Ken?
Furthering this line of thought is the fact that the Talmud discusses in detail the various types of executions, which some take as evidence that the mechanics of carrying out a death sentence were of more than theoretical concern. 4 methods of execution are discussed in the Talmud: stoning, burning, beheading, and strangulation.
Yeah, and I actually found an article about these, and it's kind of gruesome. Strangulation was interesting, though, just from a physics point of view. They basically have 2 people that wrap cloths around the person's neck, and they pull in opposite directions until the person is dead.
Ooh.
Cloth or rope or something. Sounds effective.
Ooh.
Okay, would someone else like to take the happy?
I'll pick it up.
Okay,
The death
thanks, Jerry.
penalty in Israel. The death penalty has been carried out only twice in Israel's history. The most famous instance was a case of Adolf Eichmann, the senior SS officer and leading architect of the Holocaust, who was executed by hanging in 1962 after a trial that captivated the world. The other case was shortly after Israel's establishment in 1948, when an army officer, Meir Tobiansky, was executed for treason after a court-martial in which he had no legal representation. Tobiansky was posthumously exonerated and reburied in military ceremony with full honors. Several other death sentences have been handed down over the years, but none carried out.
And I have to say, until I read this article, I never heard that Israel had another execution. So this was presumably during the War of Independence, and eloquent testimony
Rabbi, are we
to
allowed to
Bryce's
ask
point.
questions about this?
Sorry?
Are we allowed to ask questions about this?
Jay, you know I never permit questions or digressions. But in your case, I will make an exception.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
My feelings.
Mhm.
I am for the death penalty.
Mhm.
I am for the act of death penalty. I would like to know how you or the people who are on the program tonight feel. How is it that we take if we have taken Eichmann and sentenced him to life imprisonment,
Mhm.
and say, for example, he had 40 years.
You know what, Jay? I'm gonna save that discussion until the end of the article,
Okay.
because I think, what you're really raising is a very important issue, and that is a death penalty necessary for justice? That's the way I would phrase your.
No, I'm not saying phrasing this for justice, but if you want to save it to the end, I think it's. I would like to hear words of wisdom from the members of the group.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of the article. Okay, Jerry, you want to continue? Current Israeli law.
Current Israeli law allows for the death penalty only in limited circumstances. These include crimes related to the Holocaust and treason committed by a soldier during wartime. The Israeli Knesset voted in 1954 to abolish the death penalty for murder. Technically, Palestinian terrorism is liable for capital punishment under Israeli law, but Israel has never executed a Palestinian terrorist convicted at trial. Israel's military, like the US military and others, has carried out targeted assassinations of terrorist suspects, a policy validated by Israel's Supreme Court in 2006. In recent years, right-wing lawmakers have been pushing for this to change. In 2015, the Knesset overwhelmingly voted down a bill introduced by the right-wing Israel Netanyahu
No,
party.
Beitenu, Beitenu,
Beitenu, thank you.
which means our home.
Beitan-
It doesn't have anything to do with
Beitenu,
Netanyahu. That's,
right.
yeah, okay.
It sounds good. Party that would have made it easier for the bill introduced by the right-wing Israel
You went back. It would make it easier for judges.
judges to impose the death sentence on terrorists. In 2017, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called for the death penalty in severe cases, a call he issued after visiting the family of 3 Israelis stabbed to death by a Palestinian in their home in the West Bank settlement of Halamash.
Okay, someone else want to read contemporary views? I will read. Contemporary Jewish views on capital punishment. The American Jewish Committee, which conducts regular surveys of American Jewish opinion, last asked about the death penalty in 2000. At the time, 67% of Jews surveyed favored the death penalty for convicted murderers and 26% opposed, numbers comparable to the nationwide figures for that period. More recent data from Gallup found that only 54% of Jews believe the death penalty is morally acceptable, fewer than Catholics, 61%, Protestants, 66%, and Mormons, 79%. A 2014 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 33% of Jews preferred the death penalty for someone convicted of murder, compared to 54% who preferred life in prison. So you can see over time, the death penalty is becoming less popular among Jews. Democrats are also less likely than Republicans to support the death penalty, according to Gallup, and the 2016 Democratic Party platform called for its abolition, while the Republican platform called the constitutionality of capital punishment firmly settled. American Jews favor the Democratic Party by large margins. According to pollsters, overall American support for the death penalty for convicted murderers has been steadily declining for decades, with the Pew Research Center reporting in 2016 that support for capital punishment had fallen to a 40-year low of 49%. Among both secular and religious leadership of American Jewry, there is widespread opposition to capital punishment. The reform and conservative movements have long been in favor of abolishing capital punishment, while the Orthodox Union in 2004 expressed support for a moratorium pending the implementation of appropriate reforms, among them steps to address issues of fairness in the judicial system, in particular allegations of racial bias in administering the death penalty. The American Jewish Community and the Jewish Council for Public Affairs have been longstanding opponents of the death penalty. Okay, I am going to stop sharing. So now I'd like to, take up Jay's question, and why don't you,
let me ask
Go
a
ahead.
question then.
Mhm.
And the question is, one of the reasons that I am for the death penalty is I see no reason to put somebody in jail, feed them, medically take care of them, and give them 40 to 50 years of a secure lifestyle for them, the penalty. I'd like to know how this is one of the reasons that I am in favor of it.
Right. So what I would say is, and I'll invite people to share their thoughts. I think opposition to the death penalty falls largely into two areas. People might suggest others. One is the point, that Bryce eloquently raised, which is no matter how certain we say we are that a person committed a crime, we can never be absolutely certain. The jury system is the best we have, and the jury system makes mistakes. And then added to that is the issue of, of bias and there can be racial bias. Um, and there also just can be economic bias in that if you're very wealthy, you have access to, a team of smarter and better and lawyers and so on. So
Rich
that's sort
people
of,
don't get executed.
yeah. So that's one area of that's one, I would say, valid reason of opposition. The other one, which I sort of hear Jay leaning toward, is a question of justice. Is it just to someone who has taken someone's life to have a lifetime? And admittedly, a lifetime in prison may not be a great lifetime, but you listen to music, you can study, you can learn, you can be in communication. So, again, the Torah actually also, I think, twice has this eye for an eye. And the rabbis keep eye for an eye in place. It also has tooth for a tooth, wound for a wound, and so on. And the rabbis basically take that out of the equation. So I would say, it's sort of accuracy and then also justice. Jerry.
I was part of a research team addressing capital punishment and looking at the cost of keeping someone alive as to putting them to death. And at first thought, I would think it'd be a lot cheaper to put someone, keep someone alive rather than putting them to death, but it really is just the opposite.
Yeah,
It's-
you're saying you would think it would be cheaper to put them to death rather than
Yeah.
keep them alive, but
Right.
with putting someone on death row and all the appeals and so on, and how few of the people that are actually on death row actually get executed.
Right.
Yeah, okay, but I presume you wouldn't take someone convicted of a lesser crime than murder and say, well, it's going to cost us a lot of money to keep the person in prison. We should just put them to death. Yeah. So the economics, I mean, I don't think the economics are, at least for me, compelling. Bryce.
I don't really think the economics apply when you consider what is the cost to the society to be doing this. All right. And as you pointed out, for the society to at least give itself plausible deniability that it's just railroading poor people into death, to death chambers, that it tries to go through all of the legal machinery.
Mm-hmm.
And the legal machinery completely overwhelms any lifetime of savings of food and medication. It's just not even comparable. If you want to save money, get rid of the death penalty.
Yeah. So what I would say is, I think the argument is, if you're I would set aside the argument of economics, but if you're focusing on justice, then the significant possibility of injustice applied to the death penalty is greater than the impetus toward justice represented in the death penalty. I think that's a reasonable argument. Anyone else like to comment?
Taking it a little away from human ethics and more towards religion. God killing people as a punishment. There, the argument of uncertainty, of you can't be truly sure the person was guilty, no longer applies if God is all-knowing. Is it right or wrong for God to kill someone as a punishment?
Yeah, I would say, most religions would say definitionally what God does is just, but that opens up a can of worms. I don't believe for a moment that God interferes and kills someone. What the rabbis do, by the way, once they no longer have the ability to put anyone to death, what they say is that someone who would be put to death, God essentially intervenes and shortens their lifespan. But I don't think there's any, evidence for that. So I'll call first on Jay and then Bryce. You're muted, Jay. Jay, you're muted. Okay, Jay still muted. Bryce, why don't you jump in? And I'll let Jay know when he. Okay, Jay, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
This is for Steve. You actually feel that God sent somebody to death
I'm not saying it
in
doesn't
today's
happen.
day and age?
A hypothetical that I raised in order
Okay.
in order to separate out there shouldn't be a death penalty based on uncertainty versus there shouldn't be a death penalty based on the crime committed doesn't justify taking the person's life.
Okay.
At the beginning, the rabbi and one of the participants were having this discussion of, well, hypothetically, under such and such circumstances where you can be certain, well, you can't be certain even in that situation. And by having God doing it, I avoid that.
It really depends on your assumption about God. And assumption number one, is God all just and good? So if God is all just and good, then God acting to end someone's life would be just and good. And then the next question is God all powerful, which is another question, which I think is what Jay is raising. Because actually one of the justifications to make it even more pointed is the Kabbalists would say that the death of 1.5 million children in the Holocaust, I've heard there's two explanations I've heard, both are horrifying. One is this came out of Germany where Reform Judaism started. So because of the sins of that community, these children were punished. So that raises the question of God's justice. And then the other one is that the mystics would say, the Kabbalists would say, that you can suffer an early death or punishment because of sins committed in a prior incarnation, with the idea of reincarnation. Okay, Bryce and then Bethany.
Yeah, so one that got left out of the calculus there is the question about is God all knowing in the first place? Okay.
Right.
And in fact the proof text of that is in Genesis.
Yes.
And when God says, "Where are you?" All right, if God were all knowing, he would know where Adam was. But he
Right. So
didn't.
there's lots of proof text. There's lots of proof.
It wasn't.
So God is not all knowing in the first place. So the supposition that God would know that this had occurred, we don't have the evidence to support that.
Just because God asks a question doesn't mean God doesn't know the answer. Sometimes,
Right.
like especially with children, you'll ask something to which you do know the answer because you want the other person
you
to
take a
articulate
cookie?
the answer.
Yeah. So the rabbis say on that particular example, God was essentially knocking on the door by saying, I'm in the room. But a better example, the one I like to use, is in Genesis also, Genesis 6:6, where the text says that God regretted having made mankind, and it pained God to see how the creation had turned out. So I think if God was all knowing, that text doesn't hold up. So there's lots of text there. Okay, Bethany.
Do we know, I mean, outside of that, some people believe every word is the word of God. Do we know who first mentioned like the death penalty or killing someone for them having killed?
For them having what?
For them having committed murder? Do we know who first mentioned that? I mean, because it seems to me like maybe it's just like an aversion tactic, right? If people know that the law is going to be taken seriously. For me personally, if I were ever to experience suffering as a child or as an adult, I just don't do the bad thing. That would be plenty enough for me.
So I could grab my copy of Torah text where I have every page marked with who the authors are, but the first mention of the death penalty is after the flood, where it says that basically people are given the right to eat meat, but it says whoever spills the blood of man, their blood shall be spilled. And I don't remember whether that's P text or E text, but clearly it comes out of an ancient Israelite tradition. But we don't know the names of authors of any of the Torah text. So if it's in Leviticus, it's probably P text. But anyway, you have these different traditions, which were probably geographical, or, you know, in the case of the P-text were the priests. But it's very early, and as I say, it's in every book of Torah. There is a mention of capital punishment for murder. Jay.
You know, okay, this is, I hope, the last thing that I'm going to offer. This week, there was a man who was caught on drunk driving and killed somebody. The police caught him. In the last, I think, 10 years, he has been arrested 4 to 5 times on drunk driving.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
He is 35 years old. Are we going to feed and clothe this man and give him all these books to read for the next 35, 40 years?
I think the answer is unambiguously yes. You can, and I don't know of any U.S. jurisdiction that would, I just don't know. When I say I don't know, I don't mean I'm asserting it, but my sense is that killing someone in a car accident, you know, might be, I don't know, second-degree murder or something.
No,
but
he was picked up on drunk driving too.
no, I understand, but I think under most state laws, that person would not be subject to the death penalty. You know, if anyone knows something different, then I would, you know, I'd be happy to hear that, because I think the death penalty is typically reserved for premeditated murder, namely that someone plans to kill somebody, not for reckless disregard, or also, you know, crimes that take place with certain weapons, or killing a police officer. I mean, there's so special circumstances, and I'm not a lawyer, but it's not. But yeah, I mean, I think you raise. So I think the issue is justice. Is it just for someone that has such reckless disregard and has brought so much harm to someone? Is it just for that person to enjoy life? And that's a powerful issue, and it's on the other side of the justice coin is our legal system just enough to impose those penalties?
Let's go back to about 6 paragraphs of what we were reading.
Right.
And here they take a 13-year-old child. Mother takes him by the one hand, the father takes him by the, if they're both the same size. And I hear this stuff, and I guess it's one reason I hate law.
So
what kind of world is this we're living in?
So, yeah, well, also, I mean, what we're saying there is, it's in the Bible, it's in the Torah, so the rabbis just couldn't set it aside. I mean, we as Reform rabbis, and I as a Reform rabbi, would say, I don't believe God is saying that at all, but the rabbis of the Talmud is saying it.
Okay.
And then they find out a way to prove that it could not actually be carried out. Bethany.
Okay. I've done enough.
Where it becomes tricky for me is more, you know, serial killers or mass murder. That I can see, like Jay is saying. I mean, this person has clearly caused so much destruction. And, you know, whether or not we believe that the penitentiary rehabilitates people, or if people can be rehabilitated. But when I look at a serial killer, or, you know, someone taking out one of these mass murders, if we were going to do it to anybody, I feel less compelled to fight against it when it's cases like that.
Yeah. So again, it's the issue of justice versus the possible injustice inherent in the system, and I think it's real on both sides. Okay. And we're almost at 8 o'clock. Any other comments or thoughts? I want to remind you that I will not be having a class next week. Sonia and I are off traveling, and so we will have a class 2 weeks from tonight, and I don't know what we're going to discuss.
One more question for you,
Yes,
Rabbi.
yes,
Are you playing golf anymore?
yes,
Oh, you are?
yes. I am. One of the major benefits of being a rabbi is Las Posas Country Club has a clergy rate, which is embarrassingly inexpensive. And so I play there quite often. I probably should stop recording at this point. But yeah, I am not quite up to walking. A week ago, last Thursday, I walked 18 holes and I was dead and I was hurting for 2 or 3 days. So
You
I
didn't
haven't.
kill anybody. And
I'm
yet you
sorry?
were dead.
I'm sorry?
You didn't kill anybody, yet you were dead.
I can't quite understand what you're saying, but
He
it's
was making a joke,
oh, okay. Yes.
Well, I
So
just
anyway,
want to say,
yeah, but
Rabbi,
a
you've got
bad
nothing.
one.
Rabbi, you've got nothing to be ashamed of.
I didn't say I was ashamed of it. The
No,
reason
you wanted
actually,
to shut off the recording. You know, it's
oh,
no,
yeah,
it's fine. You are a legitimate clergy. No,
yeah.
you don't have to hide your head.
No, I know, I
Next
know.
time, walk 9 holes
Yeah,
instead of
yeah,
18.
I can do that. Yes, yes,
But
you're
you
right. I am
still
legitimate
afford-
clergy, and I am very grateful to Las Posas Country Club. And it's been around for like 50 or 60 years, and I am only the 10th person in the history to have a clergy membership. The 9th person, actually. It's been a few more after me. So it's not something I think people aren't aware of it. One of my congregants who was a member there found out about it, and I take great advantage of it. So with that happy thought, I will wish you a good evening, and see some of you Saturday morning, and see others in a couple of weeks.
Have a good trip wherever you're going.
Thank you, thank you. Going to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico.
Oh, woohoo! Hola!
See, and I'm not even doing a wedding there.
Bye.
I'm being just a legitimate tourist.
Can I